Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Here we are for our Thursday discussion, as we have been for the past month. I am very happy to see so many people here. We have special guests today. I invited a bunch of people from New York City who I'm hoping will be joining us. I already see some names here. And I have invited specifically Charles Sanky, who I have known now for many years. He will be speaking with us about identity in New York City and issues related to positionalities. I think what I'm going to do with Charles is more a conversation than anything else, which I think would be like an interesting thing for us to do. But before we start, the reason why I am doing this a little differently today is because it has come to my attention from emails that I received from former past attendees to this event that they would like to hear us talk about very specifically about issues related to the epicenters of the epidemic. And so I thought that we would start with New York City, where we have seen so many cases and where it has become an epicenter long before Detroit. Even though Seattle was in many ways an epicenter before New York City, it seems that things there are getting a little better. So I thought that we would start with New York, and then next week we would move to Detroit. The week after we go to New Orleans, and then we go back to Seattle for conversations that are more locally specific. So that's what I am hoping to do, along with all of my colleagues who have been helping me do this every week for several weeks now. So this program or event is sponsored by the Faculty Alliance for Diversity, and we are a group of faculty in the School of Social Work very interested in creating equity and inclusion and diversity for all of our students within the University of Michigan. We concentrate on programming that helps develop diversity, particularly in the PhD program, but also in the MSW program. And we decided to hold these conversations, and they have been well attended, and they have been very successful. So I'm very happy that we are here. I am joined by Eddie Weaver, who is the co-chair of the Faculty Alliance for Diversity. Trina Shanks, who can also be seen on the screen, a member of the Faculty Alliance for Diversity, FAD, we call ourselves. Todd Horencall is another member. David Cordova is another member. Lorraine Gutierrez is also another member of the group. And Larry Gant, who I would like to acknowledge as well as the director of the DEI program in our school, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program in our school. Before we start with the actual conversation, just reminding everyone, we love facts in this discussion. We do not, we can base our conversation on facts. We are very interested in people's feelings and people's impressions of all kinds of things. People's feelings we do not doubt, but facts we are very clear about. So I just want us to keep that in mind. And the idea that we hold very dear everything that everybody says in here. So welcome everyone. We would love to hear from as many people as possible. If you have any trouble with your images, with your audio, you can connect with Nikki Williams, who has been helping us from the very beginning. You can chat with him in, as a private chat, and he will help you with any, any issues that you may have connecting with us. The other thing that I was going to say is that people show up as in two categories. They show up as participants, and they also show up as presenters. Being in the category as presenters does not mean that you will necessarily be presenting, but I would like to ask people who I may call upon if I have a question, if you are willing to collaborate that way. So please put yourself among the presenters, so that I know that I can call on you for questions, for opinions, for different kinds of things. If you do not go to the presenter side, I will not bother you. But if you are on the participant side and you want to say something, of course, you should. but just let us know, and we will be happy to do that with you. Anyway, so it looks like the chat is already happening. People are saying hello. A bunch of people are saying hello to us, and I would say hello back to all of them. So today we are going to talk about identity and vulnerabilities because the conversations for the past 4 weeks have been about stigma, compassion fatigue. A lot of identity-related issues have come up, including identities such as of white supremacists. That came up last week. We are very interested in understanding, how everybody thinks and what it is that we can do to cope with COVID-19. So I would like for Eddie just to say a few words as my co-chair, if she chooses to do, just introducing herself very quickly. And then I'm going to ask Charles to just give us a few words about himself. I think it's better to do it that way, Charles, and to just, initiate the conversation by giving us a few points, very, short, about what has been his experience in New York City as a young man who's studying to become a doctor in the epicenter of the pandemic. And what does it mean to someone of his age, which he's going to share with us, of his generation, what it means to them today and what it is that it might mean in the future. So Eddie, go.
Hi, good afternoon, Rogerio. Thank you. I would just like to echo what Rogerio said and thank everyone for taking time today to come together, and especially those of us who have been here a few weeks together. I found this a really important space, and we hope that you all do as well. And as Rogerio said, we're very open to hearing your thoughts on what would be meaningful topics for us to engage around together. And we're very thankful that Charles could be with us today to share some of his experience in New York and for us to have some discussion and learn about some of the realities for folks on the ground in one of the epicenters of this pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. And so just so everybody knows, Charles and I know each other from Columbia University, so that we know what the connection is. When I was a professor there, Charles was at Columbia College as a student in there, and that's how we met. We did some work together on a university-wide committee about sexual respect, and we became friends, and we have been in touch for all this year. So Charles, just give us a few points about what's going on in New York City.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rogerio. Also, just want to call to everyone's attention, it is Rogerio's birthday. So that is a very important thing for everyone to be aware of. So let's start off with that. So yes, I've known Rogerio for a bunch of years now. I'm a med student, but I've had a very interesting path to med school. I've had the privilege of doing everything from research with Rogerio and a lot of research in med school, as well as some work with the health department, some work in health policy at the city, state, and national levels. And so I'm a little all over the place. What I would love to share with all of you today is the fact that I have a lot of interesting identities that are at play here. Yes, I'm on the younger side, but in addition to that, I'm a person of color who is white passing, and there's a lot of privilege associated with that, and that comes into play. There's the fact that I'll be a doctor in a year, theoretically would have become a doctor this year, but I took a research year to do an MPH and do health system design work. But then also the fact that all these experiences have come together in a way where my emergency medicine, epidemiology, and global health and health system design work, unfortunately, are the type of skill sets that are being called upon at this very moment in New York City. Really, what I just want to share with everyone is the fact that in some way, despite all the factors that affect us with respect to our identities, where there are structural and systemic factors that sometimes may not give us opportunities to engage, we have incredible capacity to transform those things into strengths that other people don't have. And I think today what I'd like to share is really how I've been able to navigate that and how I've been able to say there is incredible need. How do I use my unique experiences, my unique background to actually try to do some good here?
So can you tell us, not too long ago, we were having a conversation just like this, and you were in an empty library in New York City. So you made the choice at that point to get out of the apartment and go to the library, but it was very lonely in there. I could tell just by seeing the background, there was nobody there. What's the experience of being in New York, a city of, 8 million people, and walking along the streets and there's nobody there?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't too much walking along the streets anymore. Everything has shut down, as I'm sure it has been in Detroit and lots of other places, where fear and anxiety are very clearly in the air. You walk on the street and people run to the other side of the street. It is very, this is a scary time, I think, in all of the settings where we are. And I think that it's magnified in a place where in New York, where the numbers are so high and where we are used to such activity and used to so much, life. In the hospitals, I can speak to that as well. The hospitals are completely transformed. We have, tents in Central Park. We have convention centers and everything that are completely transformed. So the way that we used to live before, the way that the city even looked, and the way we interact with each other is completely different now.
Could you explain a little bit more about, so one of the things that we have been very interested in here is the issue related to how we identify ourselves and the many positionalities that we hold. And one thing that has come up very much in the past conversations is the idea that some people may actually be interested in the extermination of certain groups in our society, so the lack of activity to contain the pandemic, particularly in the beginning, where which could have saved a lot of lives. Some of us shared last week that we feel that was purposeful, where people who may hold certain identities, and someone brought up the idea of a white nationalist movement that would perhaps be interested in the elimination of certain groups. And how does that sound to you? And you also raised the point of being a person of color who is white passing in some ways. Would you, talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So on that first one, this crisis is exacerbating every single health inequity that we experience. Every single challenge with respect to distribution of resources, every single challenge with respect to health outcomes and income inequality, and every single challenge that we have been seeing that I would assume everybody in this group has been acutely aware of, has come really to the surface in a strong way. If you even look at, hospitals in Manhattan doing substantially better than hospitals in Queens and the Bronx, I mean, and you just think about resource allocation, that's one thing. But when you actually look at the health outcomes, especially for people of color, especially for undocumented communities where people already had perceptions about healthcare and would not access care to begin with, this has really been a problem. And so that point I take, very much that this has been something that we have not spent enough time or effort actually doing that work. And actually, every single state in the United States has to create something called a crisis of standard care, which says that the way that we allocate resources that are limited, something like ventilators or how we triage people and give them priority, there are algorithms and decisions made about who gets care and who doesn't. And at the heart of all of those things, they're incredibly flawed as well. There are structural biases with all of those things because they are rooted in things like decisions about people's health that are based on their existing comorbidities, which already there are inequities with respect to that. There are also questions about life years that you have that you would save, and there are already disparities in that. And so the point I'm trying to make is that this is exactly the problem, that we are seeing every single inequity coming to the surface in a really scary way. And this matters to me personally. So my background, my dad was born in New York, but his parents are from Italy and Syria. And my mom was born in Trinidad in the Caribbean. And so I've actually struggled a lot with that question of who am I and with respect to all these identities. I spent several years of my life in Trinidad, actually, living with my family there and having a very different experience than a lot of my neighbors growing up. And so it's all been informative, but I'm again, the experiences that I have day to day are very different than my brother, who is substantially darker than me. So these are things that I really do weigh. But my care for these issues is really really significant here, and I'm acutely aware of these things. And I think I see these questions in a way that a lot of others don't. And so the question I have for myself is always, how do I use the privilege of whatever position I'm in to actually advocate for this important work and for these communities, including my own.
Thank you, Charles, so much. There are so many people here whose name I recognize from New York City, but you have not moved to the presenter side, so I'm a little reluctant to call on you. If you are someone from New York who has not come to the presenter side and would like to speak, please come on and say something to us about your impressions of New York, what's going on with you. I've seen a lot of the names here that I know from New York. So I'll let you have like a minute to think about if you'd like to share based on what Charles just shared with us. While I am going to bring up to the conversation. So yesterday in Michigan, a group of, I forgot exactly what the name is for this group. It's conservative something. And basically they came together for a demonstration, which is of course a right that everybody has to congregate and let people know what it is that they are thinking about and what it is that they would like to see as new legislation and policy and practices. But this group of people came to Lansing yesterday precisely to advocate for going back to work, which is something that is a little different from what we have been hearing over and over again. We have been asked to stay at home, and to avoid a lot of physical contact, which is what we talked about in our conversation last week. I mean, we spent a lot of time last week talking about the idea of physical distancing and what it means for people across the globe and what it means for people who have different kinds of identities. So I would like for us, particularly people in Michigan, to contrast what we saw yesterday to the very thing that we have been experiencing, which is the request to keep social distance and to stay at home as long as we can and to abide by the order given by the governor. But at the same time, we have so many people who do not necessarily agree with this position. They say that they would like to go back to work, and they are willing perhaps to chance their own health by congregating. They were in cars yesterday, so the chances of contagion were not very high. But many of them actually congregated by the stairs of the Capitol, displaying a lot of guns. And so has anybody here who has seen this, who heard of it, would like to share it? It looks like Rosalva showed up. Are you going to share something with us? Go ahead.
I have it up on Free Press right now. The group was called Operation Gridlock. There's a Free Press article. I can send it into the chat if you'd like.
Okay, that's good to know. I would like to hear from Rosalva and Nikki. There are some people asking me in the chat. For example, Susan, she says she doesn't know how to go to the other side so she can be a presenter. So could you please explain to everybody what it is they need to do in order to be able to talk?
Right. Everybody should have a link. Now I'm seeing everybody in this who is an attendee currently has an invite. So You need to
On the
accept
top
that.
of
There's
the
a green
screen, right?
bar. I believe it's on the
So
top of the
everybody,
screen.
yes, click on the green button and you will be able to come on. Okay, Rosaba, let's hear from you. Go ahead, we can
So,
hear now. Yes.
okay, wonderful. So my understanding of the situation that happened yesterday was more not about the stay-at-home order, and I might be wrong because, there's a lot of different venues of information that gets thrown at us, but that it was more about not being able to do other things that are our constitutional right to do, and so them being more up in arms about that. What I noticed about that, being a person of a Latina, was that I did not see many people of color at the protest. At least that was shown to me, um, which is really hard for me to understand because I see it as a note of privilege. I am first generation. I am a single mother. Um, I I was typing things in about the ACE study, and I don't know if you guys have discussed the ACE study in the past, but I have like 8 or 9 of those, and so I'm a statistic. I should technically have a lot more health concerns. Thankfully, I don't. And so then thinking about the fact that some of the folks that are not able to stay at home are those that are most at risk, and those that were able to potentially go and um, protest are the ones of privilege. And so that hurts me in different ways because it just perpetuates every the agency of each instead. And I mean, I guess my thing is like, what's so wrong about those with privilege going down a notch or just a little bit so that those without privilege can like build some equity or go up a notch. I mean, I had to self-advocate for everything that I have. And so it's just, I don't know, that's what I have to share.
Thank you so much, Rosaba, for sharing that. Another point that I'll make very quickly is that some people last week talked about, of course, all the issues you just talked about privilege and underprivileged, but also the conversation last week led to, well, it went, in many directions, but one of them was that there may be that the very privilege that some of those individuals may have is the very thing that they are using to feel immortal, where they are not vulnerable to this virus. So I just want to keep that in mind for us to keep talking. Jeanette, I see you. It looks like you will talk to us. How are you? You need to unmute. You need to unmute. We can hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
Like in New York City, so many of the essential workers, everybody from postal workers, transit workers, the frontline staff and homeless shelters, the people who have to go work are people of color, right? The people who can, and I'm not saying, and even critical positions like clinicians have the option to do telecommuting and they can, even if they have to come on site from their office, they can call you. The front desk staff doesn't have that option. The maintenance staff doesn't have that option. And so the ways in which this epidemic is really hitting communities of color. And I just want to say one thing. So the city had been talking about doing incentive pay, Department of Homeless Services, DOHMH, and they want to do it for the clinical staff and not for the front desk and maintenance staff. I'm flabbergasted. It makes no sense to me. And if they don't consider those essential personnel, then they're really, I can't even say anything. Like all the advocates are on the phone calling legislators and everything, but it's so arrogant. It's just so arrogant. And the city isn't even really actually reporting real numbers like on the postal service and the transit workers and all that. we know that those are not true numbers. And if you haven't gone in to be diagnosed and they're saying if you have symptoms, just stay home, so you're going to be undercounted. But then also, even if you're a part of a union, you're not going to get to claim the extra benefits. And if you die, you don't get the death benefits as job related, even though you got it on the job.
Jeanette, so I'm sure a lot of people have reactions to what you just said. But before, I want to ask you to say a few words about your work helping the homeless, because it's something that is so prevalent everywhere, but clearly.
Yeah, so I serve 3 specific homeless populations: young families, mothers under the age of 25, LGBTQ young adults, and seniors. So all very, very vulnerable. As we know, LGBTQ young adults are disproportionately represented in the homeless system, and they're the least likely to seek shelter within the system. So a lot of drop-in centers, the youth-focused drop-in centers have closed. They haven't been able to stay open. They just couldn't figure out a way to do it safely. And New York City is not one of those places that has been very creative about how providers can use money. In other places, they've actually just been giving out cash to young adults specifically because they can get rooms together, to get through the next 6 or 8 weeks. But New York is just very, very bureaucratic. So it's been a problem.
Thank you so much. So next week we are going to make comparisons. We are learning a lot from New York City, the first epicenter that we are, talking about. And then next week we'll make comparisons to Detroit, and the week after we'll make comparisons to New Orleans. I'm hoping that that's how we are going to be, moving in that direction. It would be very nice to do so. Chidima, I have seen you there, and I wasn't sure that you wanted to speak. Do you? Meanwhile, I'm going to call. Oh, go ahead.
So thank you. Oh, yeah, thank you. And happy birthday. It's a gift to be alive.
Thank you.
So, yeah, no, I appreciated the last person that was speaking and highlighting, because some of you know me, and what I'm going to say to start us off is we not only have a racism problem, we have a connecting the dots problem. And so as such, I appreciated what Professor Price wrote in the chat. What's confounding for me, I've been angry for the last not a fully 24 hours. Once I saw in my family group chat, we engaged in a lot of discourse, and one of my brothers sent over photos, and I was just thinking about, so this Operation Gridlock actually blocked emergency personnel from doing their jobs, and they're essential. Had 3 strokes Thursday, December 14, 2017, here in Ann Arbor. And I thought, what if this was happening here in Ann Arbor? So it helped me, even though I was angry, I was able to reflect that scene probably would not take place here in Ann Arbor. And so there's some class or socioeconomic stuff, privilege, perhaps. And then additionally, layering onto the fact that I saw the photos, and I didn't see folks that appeared to me, from what I'm socialized to know as Black, Indigenous people of color. I saw folks with guns. I saw folks with Confederate flags. I saw folks that were out of their vehicles. There were more than 10 of them. I didn't notice any masks. Apparently someone was giving children candy. And all of this to say that if we were to switch it, and what if folks that look like me, so I identify as a Black woman, so folks that were Black did the exact same thing? There would be bloodbath. It would be chaos and confusion. There are Black men today that feel uncomfortable wearing masks, even though the CDC has provided changes and recommendations. And so folks don't feel comfortable wearing masks, even though that is something that would help protect them, because things are ever changing, and because they don't want to die. So it's like weighing the option of, do I pass away possibly from COVID-19, or is it either police brutality or racism, straight up race, good old fashioned racism, where someone says that I walked on their something, right? And I'm thinking about the young boy in Florida who was killed, so Trayvon Martin, thank you, who would have been 25 this year. So there's so many things that we have to tease out, and we can't actually do anything if we're not actually naming things. Like, that is straight up white supremacy. It is related to race, and not to even talk about the disparities in who's working right now, who's essential, who is actually 48% of those in Washtenaw County that are hospitalized are Black from COVID-19. And we represent 14% of the population in Washtenaw County. So I've received data. I don't speak without having data support what I'm saying. And we just have to actually really talk about some of these things.
Chidma, thank you so much for all that you have said. We are getting, I think we are freezing a little bit in there, but I want to just, remind us how Chidma began her talk by saying that we need to, line up the dots or connect the dots. And I think she did it beautifully. And it's one thing that I'm going to keep trying to do as much as I can. I'd like to go and ask Daisha if she could speak to us. What she said in the chat is really very important, because she's questioning different kinds of privilege, right? And she's questioning social privilege, economic privilege, and she is in some way positionalities may give us more or less privilege. So Daisha, if it is okay with you, could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Thank you. Happy birthday again. But I think that what I was seeing when I was looking at people in the videos of the protest was really trying to consider how racism and white supremacy actually literally impacts everyone in a negative way. And the way that I see it impacting them is that it seems like they don't even have the ability to recognize the different intricacies of how this is impacting people, just people in general, first of all, but because it's not directly impacting them as an individual, that they are just upset and want to be able to do what they want to do. When people talk about this privileged identity, especially when we're talking about race, I think some people who have white skin often feel like they should have privilege, but because of their other identities, such as social class, economic stature, things like that, they don't really have the privilege the power that they want to have. So I think it comes out in this way. And so it's very frustrating, but also something that I realize we have to recognize that even though they are white, they are acting out of what is the outcome of racism and white supremacy, and that's what it looks like. So I just want to think about that. And I also just wanted to share with everyone, I want to thank people for being here, because we talk about undoing racism in different ways at the school, and for all of us to be coming together to talk about how can we hold others accountable by developing a community internally is really, really important. So I just wanted to say
Thank you so much, Daisha. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to call anyone in particular now, but so here's what I think is happening here. I would like for us to go back to COVID-19, because what I saw happening in Lansing yesterday could have happened at any time during the year for any kind of reason. It has happened before. It will continue to happen. Has the highest number of militias across the 50 states of the United States. So this demonstration of power that we saw yesterday could have happened under different circumstances. But I was wondering if someone would like to comment on the fact that it happened while we are in the middle of a pandemic. I just don't want to lose sight and make sure that, and because I think of a pandemic, right? It probably has many different kinds of implications. Can I call on anyone to comment on this?
Well, as initially the material, like people weren't as focused on the disparities. As the death rate has gone up and the hospitalization rate has increased, everybody is talking about how persons of color are disproportionately represented, right? And we're dying faster, and it's all related to the underlying health issues and health disparities in society. So obviously, this is a perfect opportunity for, white supremacy to say, hey, let's all get back to work, because we will be, the people who are dying are people of color and marginalized people. So I think that we're going to see more of that, actually, in this push to reopen the economy. Because especially, I don't think that they're really thinking that, it is, while it's disproportionately hitting communities of color, it is not solely hitting communities of color. And if it goes back up again, the very sick may have already gotten sick, right? So then when we get to the moderately healthy, who is that group? I don't think anybody's thinking about that. And I think if you're thinking from a purely, this will kill the brown people, you may really think this is a great time for everybody to get back, and let's see how many people we can infect and get sick and just, genocide.
Thank you, Jeanette. Since we are talking about the topic of white supremacies, for 2 weeks now, of course, we have been since the very beginning when we started with just, the very initial stigmatization of people of Asian descent. And then we have moved on to talk about all kinds of things, but we keep piling them up as we move along. I wonder if Susan, and you can, talk about anything you want, Susan, but I want to call on you if you can speak a few words about, do we think that white supremacy looks the same in, say, Michigan and New York? And I'm going to be asking that question. Does it look the same in Detroit and Lansing? Does it look the same in Seattle or New Orleans? What are your thoughts about, the manifestation of this supremacy in the middle of the epidemic?
Well, my gut is yes, but I would love to comment on what we were talking about and what you raised just earlier about this happening in the midst of a pandemic. I come at this from, I'm a parent, I'm a partner, I'm a friend, I'm a social worker, I'm a practitioner, but I'm also a researcher. And so from the perspective of research, if we're talking about white supremacy and the danger of genocide, just the other day, I was sitting in on a symposium. So because of COVID-19, once a week at my institution, there's 3 hours where some of the best genetic minds in the world are getting together and reporting what they're finding. What's the latest we understand about the way to get to a vaccine? What do we understand about who's presenting with what symptoms? How are we doing in terms of year? And so it's all of these very intellectual presentations about science, including genetics. And 2 weeks ago, a geneticist who's quite famous, also a woman of color, happened to say, when asked about getting samples, well, when people have died, we don't need human subjects, because apparently when you're dead, you're not a human subject. I heard that comment, and as a social worker, of course, I bristled and just went quiet. But the symposium proceeded until another researcher who was on the call, named Margaret Crosby Arnold, who happens to be a historian from Brown University, now at Columbia, whose expertise is in immigration in Europe, said, wait a minute, this is a huge problem. We can't let this go. And then she was invited to come back this week. So this week she came back and gave a 10-minute presentation about who's dying of this virus. We know that underlying conditions is really code for racism. And what we know is that each of you people who are reporting need to be very careful of this slippery slope, because what's happening is what happened in the Warsaw ghettos. So typhus was raging, and the Jewish individuals who were living with typhus were dying, and the Nazis wouldn't serve them, and they used the typhus to engender hatred among more of the local ethnic Poles to hate the Jews. And so, her point was in 10 minutes to basically, cut through all of this nonsense about, new findings and the need for following. I think the danger is, as a scientist, when we get into crisis mode, the same genocidal tendencies kick in, and people forget that we're talking about human beings, and these are human beings with power. So I just wanted to kind of throw that into the conversation, because it wasn't until Dr. Arnold spoke up that it occurred to me that we need to be so careful, because this is such a dangerous, dangerous time, not for me, but for many of the people that I've worked with and I hope on behalf of.
Thank you so much, Susan, for sharing. Any reactions from what Susan just said? I have many, but I will ask somebody else to react.
Rogerio, this is Trina.
Yes, go ahead, Trina. Thanks.
I had two thoughts, one directly to what you said and one to the larger conversation. This idea of, I'll put it in another context first. So oftentimes, not so much lately because the conversations have come up more, but when people talk about, those people who are in prison or those people who've been put in jail, it's like a whole nother population. But when you're talking about people of color and people who are poor, it's their brothers, it's their cousins, it's their friends, it's people they know. So not just people, it's like known people, because they know people who've either been falsely accused or in prison or had interaction with the criminal justice system. But oftentimes for privileged white people, it's like they don't know anybody directly necessarily who has been in prison. So it becomes a them as opposed to, people, right? And so similarly with this, and I don't want to presume too much, but let's say privileged white people who live in the UP who haven't known anybody personally who's died from COVID-19, it's kind of like, look at all the things that are happening to me because this disease is happening to them. But at least for me, there's people from my church, people in my family, people I know personally who have either sick with COVID or have died from COVID. And so it's not just those people, those numbers, but it's like people who are known to me, who I love, who I care about. And so, so privilege is partly, what you have and how you think about yourself, but it's also who your network is and who is around you and who you're familiar with and who you care about. And sometimes those circles are very different depending on where you come from and who you know and who you associate with. And I'm not even making that a judgmental thing, but just the people who you are aware of, and that it hits you more personally. And so being aware of that, at least, particularly for the scientists and the people who talk about it in a very, sterile academic sense as opposed to real people. The other thought I had about this point is when the term underlying health conditions come up, it's often almost a blame thing. So, why are you overweight, or why aren't you taking care of your asthma, or why do you have diabetes, or why blah, 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 as opposed to thinking about it's very rooted in race. It's very rooted in access to healthcare. It's very rooted in, again, the circles you run with and what you know and how you grew up, and all of those things. And so it's almost like you're being blamed for being sick or being blamed for having underlying health condition, as opposed to these things aren't just choices. These things are things that often are part of who you are. And I know that wasn't super well thought out, but that's my reaction to all those thoughts.
I think it was beautifully thought out. I just want to make sure to stress something that Trina said, which made me think about, we have been speaking of privilege at the individual level, and I think that many times we speak of the individual level and then as a group level kind of a thing. And I think what, Trina just stressed out for us is how important it is to see those things as a part, but also at the same time extremely together, where, the individual in the community may have a set of identities and positionalities, but those are connected to the individual who is in jail. So it brings up the whole community business, which isn't necessarily always geographically bound. I mean, that's the kind of thing that that I heard so well from Trina. Thank you for, from bringing that. I'm going to go back to Charles, and I'm going to ask him if, in his experience in the hospital, in the more medical settings, which we don't, as a student, which I would like for you to concentrate on that, Charles.
Yeah.
How do you see the manifestation of the things that we are talking about, like the blaming of people with, conditions that are out of their control, right? I mean,
yeah,
or manifestations of this, choosing to treat X instead of Y in this person, and do you see any manifestation of this idea of white supremacy in the hospital?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, absolutely. We see that all the time. I want to point out that a lot of what we're talking about is also a sense that I'm feeling. I don't know if others feel the same way. It has been a sense of powerlessness the past several weeks. Like, these things are out of our control and happening to us because this is an overwhelming pandemic that has hit close to home. As Trina said, like, this is personal for a lot of us. I've lost 4 people in 3 weeks that I care about deeply, that I grew up having. I have gone to 3 virtual funerals at this point. This is incredibly personal. And yes, I'm a medical student, but because of whatever weird way things work, for all of a sudden I have some expertise, whatever in the world that means. And so my role now is actually, I've gotten this weird battlefield promotion where I oversee the convalescent plasma trial and the tocilizumab trial, which are 2 treatments that we are looking at in New York as well as throughout, the United States. But I am overseeing these trials. I am redesigning hospitals and several times a week going to Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, which is one of our biggest hit New York City ones, but also a lot of the other city hospitals, and redesigning it based on what we know about how we need to do better. But I will tell you, on all the Zoom calls that I'm in, the conversations are sterile. No, people are not talking about the losses that they've experienced. People are not talking about this in any way other than a utilitarian, cold way of saying, well, we want to save the most number of lives and people who are going to live longest, which is code for everything that we've been talking about. As I've mentioned before, the standards of care in terms of resource allocation is all based on, to what extent you have comorbidities, to what extent you have much more life to live. And these are terribly scary conversations that we're having. And I think what's frustrating is, 100% of the time being the youngest person in any of these calls with no experience and being one of the very few people who have a background that's not 100% white, which is all of these meetings, being the person who has to voice those things and say, hey, hold on a second. What you were talking about is problematic and here's why. And that is a lot to put on one person. But I guess the point is, yes, Rogerio, this is happening all the time, even in like the New York City hospitals where they are stretched thin. And any progress that we make that collectively, I don't think I'd be incorrect in assuming that everyone on this call has been working so tirelessly for many years to try to contribute to growth and societal understanding. But in times of crisis, we have derailed, and our implicit biases have become very explicit.
Anyone would like to build upon this? We are approaching, the hour. Thank you so much, Charles, for sharing, this very personal account. it's always good to make sure that we do that. The last thing that we would like is just to begin to think of people in some abstract form, that human beings are no longer human subjects, like Susan, brought up. Anyone? If not, I want to ask a question. Anybody? There was a question from before that Lily asked to Jeanette, and I don't want that to go unanswered. I just want to connect the question, which is, where are the homeless going to in New York City, given all that Jeanette, talked about? But I want to make a connection between that or in prison and those in the community. And I think that we talk about the homeless very similarly to how Trina described. So Jeanette, if you could, answer Lily's question about where are they going, and if you can connect that answer to what Trina said.
I mean, I think that, so New York City has one of the largest homeless systems. Housing, shelter, not permanent housing. Shelters are right in New York. So we do have one of the largest shelter systems in the country. And we had been, prior to this, the goal of the administration was to move out of hotels and to move into purpose-based shelter. So once COVID hit, they literally went back to some of the hotels that they had just decommissioned as homeless shelters and brought them back online, because a lot of shelters are actually congregate, so you don't have privacy. So what they needed to do was come up with, a couple of thousand isolation units, so that people because what they're saying is, if you have symptoms but you're doing okay, they don't want you to go to the hospital, they want you to be in a private space. But in so many of the adult shelters and the youth shelters, that space is a shared, if you're lucky, it's a room with 2 people. It could be a room with as many as 8 people sharing a bathroom or a communal bath. And so there was no ability to isolate. So they've ramped up those units, and so people are kind of taken out of one shelter. A new person can come in, but the person's taken out of shelter to self-isolate. I think part of the issue, one of the issues in New York, is that obviously a significant portion of the people who are homeless are also actively using and or have a mental health diagnosis, and therefore kind of measuring people's capacity to self-isolate, right? So even in shelter even in places where people have apartments and supportive housing, where people have the actual physical space where they could do it, especially while people are addicted, they are not really isolating. I mean, they're still going out, and then you're not sure who they have been in touch with when they come in. So we've put all of these elaborate things at front doors where we're kind of doing, but if you have a lease, right? If it's supportive housing, you have a lease. So we, hand washing and Purell. I don't think I've ever used so much Purell in my life. I think youth shelters are actually in worse shape, because almost all of them are shared spaces. There are very, very few youth shelters that are private space, and so another privilege is having the ability to self-isolate. People without homes often don't. Even people in homes, there was a big conversation about, I think Chris Cuomo on CNN was talking about how he had moved into his basement because he thought he was infected. Well, now it turns out his wife is, but he could for a week and a half live in his basement. Many people don't have basements. They're in 1-bedroom apartments. They're in, it's just impossible. You've got 1 bathroom, 4 people, So, I mean, I think this is, the old underlying kind of issues of kind of poverty is really coming to the fore on this. And then, the access, I mean, people of color don't have a lot of faith in the healthcare system, have been, have a long history of being abused and mistreated, in many, many, many ways. So some of those underlying health conditions are actually getting diagnosed now. not necessarily, they didn't come in saying, oh, I know I've got COPD and I'm at risk, right? They were just home coughing up their guts normally, right, in the normal course of events. And now they are in the hospital realizing that they also had this underlying condition. I don't know. It's and we have such a wonderful king.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for reminding us and for sharing all this information. I so appreciate having this, and I can't wait for next week to do a little more detailing on Detroit, and then the following week in different cities, because the experience is very different. And having this perspective in this conversation was really, and not in necessarily exciting the nice way, but like exciting, emotionally and also intellectually. So thank you. Kasia, I see you on the screen. I have lost connection for a few moments. Do you want to share something with us?
Well, just that I have it, and also that I live in Ypsilanti, and I walk my dog at like midnight, and the silence, it's like being in the forest, the silence at times. And I mean, I have COVID-19. I've been sick for like 31 days now. It's really bad. So.
Well, it's sorry to hear that, but I'm very happy to see you joining us. How have you coped for all this time?
Just trying to be tough as nails. Like, that's all you can do, right? So yeah, it's been a time, but because I'm supposed to be moving, and I'm by myself and no one can help me right now, but it's getting worked out. It's all gonna be okay, just take some doing. And but one of my clients also has it, and she's, all my clients in my field placement, and in community mental health, I think I only have one who's not diabetic. One of my clients appears to have it. They don't want to waste a test on her because it looks like that's what it is, and they're just making her stay home. But so it's it's affecting, and it's another place where it's affecting marginalized people sooner. So, and just being on the front lines of that. And I've tried to stay really on top of the science, because been a part of my role has been like just kind of being a steady presence of that, with people getting, even into wild conspiracy theories about some of it, and it can become a mental health issue in and of itself, like how you handle the, corona crisis, COVID-19, whatever. So yeah, I mean, my clients are doing great. I'm really proud of them. They're amazing. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing and for disclosing to us. It makes this so much more real and more personal, right? So I thank you for being here with us. We are now, closing our session. Thank you for helping us to close, Kasia. I hope to see you here again, and I hope that you get better and better.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to thank Charles for joining me from the beginning, and sharing his very personal experience with COVID-19. I want to thank everyone who came to this talk. Thank you, Eddie, for being there always. Trina for speaking up and helping. And so I would like for us to continue on with the same conversation next week. And so we'll be, of course, we talk about everything here, but we'll probably continue on with identity and vulnerability. I think we made a really good connection there. We will keep connecting the dots, as Stigma suggested, and pay attention to all the issues that we have been talking about. I love to see the diversity of ideas being shared here, and how representative of different groups and populations we are. So without any delay, thank you so much, and we are signing off. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rogerio. Bye.
Bye.